Some of you will know more than I do about this man, Hezekiah Balch. I know there's at least two here know who he was, but I'll enlighten the rest of you. He is the founder of Tusculum College, 1794. It was then called Greeneville College. Also, he was the first pastor of Mount Bethel Presbyterian Church. Now, let me tell you a little bit about him. 1741, he was born in Deep Creek, Maryland. And I'm sure you wonder how he got here. I'm going to try to tell you. As a very young man, the family moved to Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, which is where Charlotte is located. And as a young man, he grew up in that area. Then in 1766, he was awarded his Master of Arts degree from Princeton. Of course, that's in New Jersey. And you can just imagine how far he had to travel and the mode of travel that he had to use at that time. Because this was before the Declaration of Independence had even been signed, written and signed. Then the next year he started studying to be a minister in the Presbyterian Church. In 1769, he married Hannah Lewis, and to that union there were 6 children born, 4 boys and 2 girls. And then the next year, in 1770, he was ordained a minister in the Presbyterian Church. And until 1782, he was a pastor for the various Presbyterian churches in that part of North Carolina. You know, of course, North Carolina at that time extended from the ocean all the way to the Mississippi River. And where you're standing right now at that time was a part of North Carolina. Then in 1782, he came to Greeneville and assumed the first pastorate of the Mount Bethel Presbyterian Church. And that was also the year that the capital of Franklin was moved from Jonesboro to Greeneville. And a replica of that capital was located in Greeneville. And 3 years later, in 1785, he acquired 250 acres of land south of Greeneville, about 3 miles, on Richland Creek. And there he built one of the first 2-story log houses in the area. He did that because he had a great desire to educate the young men in this area. There were very few schools, and he was very anxious that they would get an education. He worked on that for 9 years until 1794, when he was able to obtain a charter for Greeneville College. And that charter was given from the territory south of the Ohio and west of the Allegheny Mountains. That was federal territory at that time. Then the next year, in 1795, he went back to New England to raise money for the college. And while there, he became acquainted with a new theological doctrine in the Presbyterian Church. And when he came back, he started preaching that doctrine in his congregation. And it created a problem in that it was controversial. As a result, he was tried 16 times before the presbytery because of that, and 4 times before the synod, and they even locked the church door on him and wouldn't let him preach in the building for a while. And when they did that, he preached from the front steps of the church and went on. As a result, the congregation split, and those who were in disagreement with his preaching of that doctrine moved over to Main Street, where you now have the First Presbyterian Church. But he continued here, and it was then called Harmon Church, and that's why you have the cemetery here called Harmon Cemetery. Then, following that, he, of course, continued with his ministry and also with Greeneville College. But in 1806, his wife died. And of course, she's buried right here. And then that same year, he went up to Massachusetts, where he was awarded a Doctor of Divinity degree from Williams College. And that's why he is known today as Dr. Hezekiah Balch. Also then, when he came back the next year in 1807, he freed his slaves. He apparently had become acquainted with the emancipation things that were going on, and the newspaper that was being printed here in Greeneville, I think the first one, and then moved to Jonesboro. But he did free his slaves. Then the next year, in 1808, he married again, and because of ill health, he was not having a good time physically. In 1810, he passed away, and he is buried here at his express request next to his first wife, because he asked for that to be done in his will. His second wife lived 25 years after he died, and she is buried in Jonesboro with her family. Any questions about Hezekiah Boss? Not that I can answer, but I'll try.
What was that theology?
Every group
That
has
different
that.
doctrine you're talking
I wish I could tell you exactly, but I have been told that it had to do with the doctrine of baptism, and that, and I don't know which side he was preaching, but he had a doctrine that if you were not, you would not go to heaven. And of course, you had a lot of families where babies would die then, more so than today, without being baptized, and that was creating quite a stir, you know, with the families that had lost children. So I think that's what it was. But if we do this again, I'll research that.
Oh, you have to do it again. You have to.
Well, I told him I was getting too old for this. I want somebody else to.
Can you talk or shed any light on the relationship between Samuel Doak and Hezekiah?
I might could do a little. I know there was rivalry between the two. And of course, Bosch got his college in 1794. And Samuel Doak, I believe, got his about 1814. I think I'm about right on that. And they continued to operate the two colleges separate. And then when the Civil War came along, both colleges almost ceased to exist. And after the war was over, they combined the two into one and called it Greeneville and Tusculum College. Then several years later, they dropped the Greeneville and it is now Tusculum College. But Tusculum rightfully still says they're the oldest college west of the Alleghenies by virtue of the 1794 charter given to Greeneville College. Now, I've heard a lot of things about it that they were so in disagreement. I'm going to tell you something I haven't said because the gong hasn't sounded. But I understood the two met on the sidewalk one time, and that was when you had muddy roads, and it was probably a wooden sidewalk. And one or the other said, "I will not make way for the devil," and the other one stepped down and said, "I will." Now, I don't know how true that is, but I've heard that for years.
Of course, we at Tusculum College know who said the first.
Well,
and who said the second.
yeah, I'm a product of the school, so I'm very proud of the school.
I've seen the where the Greeneville College site is. It's at the Asheville Highway, the old Asheville Highway, or Whirlwind Road
It's
1.
you go out about 3 miles, and there is a marker there, and that is on the 250 acres that he bought.
And there's nothing up there.
No,
Are there even
not now.
ruins or anything?
Well, 200 years, you know, there wouldn't be.
It's
But can
cows.
you stop and imagine even that 3 miles?
That's a long way out.
Yes, because you did not have
Yeah.
roads like we have. You didn't have cars, and that's all. That was just, you know, horseback, maybe.
I wonder why they
wagon.
put him so far away. Even Tusculum, I suppose, is pretty far away from
Yeah,
everything.
well, when I was in school out there, it was far away. Yeah, I remember it was during World War II. We commuted back and forth into town, and you did not have buses and this kind of thing. And we would come in maybe and go to the movies. There was no way to get back except to walk, but I would thumb And I'll never forget, I rode my first motorcycle on the back. One of the students had a motorcycle, and he came by and stopped and told me he'd take me, and I thought a few minutes, but I climbed on with him. But yeah, I remember my schooling there very well.
I guess keeps the distractions down.
Well, some of our students at Tusculum still feel it's a long way to walk to McDonald's.
Oh my. What I would have given for a McDonald's when I was there.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Joseph Brown. It's a pleasure to have you with me this evening. I don't get many visitors anymore, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1767 in Aitrin County, Ireland. Times were tough during my childhood in Ireland, and a young man, if your family didn't own land, the most you could hope for was to work a few odd jobs until you could save up enough money to maybe purchase a piece of property and farm. So at age 39, I had worked several odd jobs and saved some money. Had a couple of uncles in Philadelphia. They had written and told us what a magnificent land the New World was, and that we should come. So I acquired fare on a seafaring vessel. The most miserable 32 days I have ever spent in my life. The water was putrid, but they'd give you a little gill of rum to drink with it. We had salted pork in barrels, which wasn't fit to eat, and if you did eat it, it made you want to drink the putrid water. I never will forget seeing land off the bow of that ship, the most beautiful sight that I had ever seen. I had never seen anything look so magnificent. And Philadelphia was such a wonderful city, so clean, and my two uncles were there, and they took me under their arms. They said, "Son, we're going to teach you our business. Stay here with us." And I wasn't about to get back on that ship. So I learned to be a businessman from my uncle in their mercantile store. And after 4 years, they sat me down. They said, "Son, if you want to be a man of gentry, you need to own property. And the West has all the property that man can want. You save money, you know business, it's time to go west." So I set out down the Shenandoah Valley, the Great Wagon Road, arrived outside of Abington at the Dinwiddie Tavern. Decided to get a hot meal and a nice bed for the night, if you call a bed with 6 other people nice. I never will forget what I saw at that tavern. The most beautiful sight I'd ever beheld. More magnificent than seeing the land off of that ship. Her name was Elizabeth Alexander, a beautiful little redhead. And I told that girl I was going to marry her. She just giggled, but I could tell she loved me too. Some gentlemen that I was talking with said, "Son, you ought to go down to that new state of Tennessee. They just carved it out of North Carolina. Plenty of land there. There's a town 13 years old called Greeneville. Go there." So I came down to Greeneville, started a store over here on Main Street, bought 200 acres of land outside of town and started farming. And then I went back and I married that little girl, and I brought her to Greeneville. Oh, things were great. Business flourished. My uncle sent us goods down from Philadelphia. Then in 1812, the winds of war began to stir. They started calling for volunteers, and being Irish, you know, if we can't fight somebody else, we like to fight ourselves. So I signed up with Captain James Penny's East Tennessee Militia, and off we marched. Army life was about like 32 days on that ship. We fought mostly hunger and mosquitoes. So we got down to Alabama, and our Cherokee guides came and they said, "We have found a creek camp." and it's ripe for taking. And took it we did. We massacred them. Only to find out that General Jackson had signed a peace treaty with them. Old Hickory wasn't very happy with us. So the East Tennessee militia came back to East Tennessee. I went back to farming and back to business. Our family flourished, the business flourished. Never will forget one day in 1826, a young man came leading a blind horse with his younger brother, and their mother was sitting in the cart. Came in the store and he says, "Sir, I'd like to acquire some fodder for my horse." I said, "Son, you just go with my boy William. He'll take you to the farm and you can get all the fodder you need." A couple hours they came back and the young man gave me a couple shillings for the fodder. Heard him and my son talking, and my son said, "Well, you know, we've got this broadcloth from Philadelphia. Do you think you could make me a new suit?" The young fellow looked at him. He said, "Well, you know, I could use some business right now." This young man's name was Andy Johnson. Seeing that we had the supply of broadcloth from Philadelphia and that Greeneville needed a tailor, he decided to make this his home. Son William later married Johnson's daughter, Mary. Andy Johnson and I served together in the city legislature. I served on the board of Greeneville College and even taught right here in the Harmony Presbyterian Boys School. I passed away in 1845, and my wife Elizabeth lived to 1865 and the close of the Civil War. The farm was divided and subdivided. The business stayed in the family for generations. But all we have now is this little plot right here, and no one ever comes to see us anymore. And I appreciate you coming on with me. Try to get away from it.
Well, how were you?
1767.
Oh, God.
67.
I said 78. Whatever you say.
Is your whole family
I
buried
said
here?
45.
I just said stuff on the side.
Joseph Brown.
Oh, where's the farm?
Y'all asking too many questions. It was outside over about where the Andrew Johnson golf course was.
Well,
originally
I'll get it
built
right
the
now. Is it Joseph Brown?
Actually going to Andrew Johnson.
Okay, keep an eye.
We can have buildings like that. Everybody's house.
Hello there, Blank's daughters. How are you?
A little too informal, wasn't I, Mr. Severe?
Your Highness, Your Majesty.
Sun in my eyes.
Yeah, come over here. You might be more comfortable over here where it's in the shade a little bit.
I'm walking on somebody's grave. Right. Oh, you got a pothole? You found one.
Uh-oh. Well, hit it louder than that. Well, good evening. I'm awful glad you're here tonight. Welcome to our first Whispers from the Grave Cemetery tour. The idea is to give you some idea of our history and some of the wonderful people that were founders of Greeneville. I'm one of them. My name is Valentine Severe. As you can see, to give you some idea of a date, I was born in 1780. That's 6 years before Greeneville became a town. And I died in 1854. And the doctors weren't quite sure what it was, and so they called it a chronic upset of the liver. So that's what that was. Some very interesting people who are buried here. I have two wives. My first wife was Nancy. And you know how many children Nancy and I had between, anyone could guess?
More than 3?
More than 3?
8.
Keep going.
13.
13. Oh, you cheated. 13. All right. We had 13, and then my second wife Minerva there. We had 2. And buried here right around me, I have 4 children and 2 grandchildren. A couple of soldiers are buried here. There's Alexander, who's right the 3rd grave on in there. He was a soldier of the War of 1812. And then Joseph, which is that first tall rounded stone, was a Confederate soldier killed down by Atlanta in 1864. Well, I'm the nephew of a very famous severe, Noah Chucky Jack, who has some distinctions which are worthwhile noting. He was the first and only governor of what state?
Franklin.
You guys are so sharp. It's wonderful. The state of Franklin, of course, the capital is right across the street, the replica of it. The original was lost after one of the World's Fairs here in Tennessee. He was also the first governor of the state of Tennessee. All right, now here's a toughie for you. What other famous Tennessean was the governor of 2 states?
David Crockett.
No, he was close. He was governor of Tennessee and of Texas. Sam Houston. So Tennessee has quite some famous people. But Sevier are my relatives. I was a very, very active man in Greeneville. I was the deputy county court clerk, then I became the county court clerk, and then the circuit court clerk. I was so well known for my handwriting that people commented that I had the most beautiful handwriting of any person that's had office in Greeneville. At our last tour, some of our visitors complimented that they were doing genealogy and had found some of my handwriting and noticed how beautiful it was. Okay, I got my quizzers here, so let me ask you another question. How many of the houses that I lived in are still standing here in Greeneville?
1.
Close. 2. The oldest existent house in Greeneville was my house, built in 1795. It's right across the street down here from the Andrew Johnson homestead. Believe it or not, that is a 2-story log cabin. What later owners did was to put white clapboard on the outside of it so it looks like a clapboard house. If you drive by, it looks like a clapboard house, but it is really a 2-story log cabin. If you ever get lucky enough to go inside, they have taken a little cutout of the wall inside, and you can see the log construction through this little window inside the house. Another thing that's interesting, if you drive by or walk by and look carefully at the small windows in the house, those are the original glass windows, 214 years old. Either kids were very poor with rocks when they threw them, or he's been very, very lucky. My other house, but the one that I loved more than any other, is just up the street from the library. It's the boxwood house that has the huge boxwood plants out in front. It was made out of brick, and something interesting, the bricks for that house were built right on site. When we dug, we found a vein of clay. We were able then to take the clay, my slaves made the bricks, burned them on site, and built 3 buildings, the house, a workshop, and slave quarters from the brick that came from that particular pit. The woodwork inside, again, if you ever get a chance to go inside, all handmade on site or in some of the shops here in Greeneville itself by Irish artisans. I was also very involved in Greeneville politics. I was the mayor of Greeneville in 1818, and I did a darn good job of administrator, if I can say so myself. And I got friends with a very, very nice young man named Andrew Johnson. And he was a tailor. His shop was just right down the street there, and he and I became very good friends, but it soon became evident that we were in opposite ends of the political spectrum, and we call it the infamous election of 1829. He beat me for mayor. 1 vote. But it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. Let me tell you the story behind the story. Back in those days, when you voted, you just didn't go to the voting booth and put your little clicker or push the buttons as you do today. You had to write out in longhand the names of the people that you were voting for. So Johnson and his supporters got together the Saturday night before the election and practiced writing out the ballot so that they could write in the names of all the people they wanted to. And they figured out how many people they would have to beat me. And sure enough, they ousted 20 of Greenville's finest from my party, and his party took control, and Greenville politics have never been the same since. Slavery was an issue when I lived here in Greenville, and as I mentioned a moment ago, I had slaves. I had 15 of them. In fact, in my household of 1830, there were 27 people living in my house, 15 of them slaves. And about this time, a movement started in the Presbyterian Church and also among the Quakers to liberate the slaves, and I felt this was a very good thing to do, and so I gathered my slaves around me, and you'll never know what happened. Anyway, to make a long story short, 10 of them elected to take freedom, and I paid their way to go to Africa to the colony of Liberia. Another story. Okay, I guess your guide will take you on to the next.
Okay, again, my name is Blackston McDaniel. I was born January the 15th, 1811 in Knoxville, Tennessee, to John and Sarah McDonald. You'll note a name change from my parents being McDonald to McDaniel. That was just kind of a common practice back then. On March the 6th, 1828, age 17, I was bound as an apprentice to Thomas Crutchfield here in Knoxville, Tennessee, to learn the art and mastery of brick mason. Besides being a brick mason, I also served as a plasterer, I was an alderman, I was a merchant, and a U.S. Marshal appointed by Abraham Lincoln and then reappointed by Andrew Johnson. I was also regarded as one of Andrew Johnson's closest friends. I served as a pallbearer at his funeral, and we were just really close friends. One other thing, I was also part of what was called the Big Four here in Greeneville, which that consisted of Mordecai Lincoln, which he married Andrew Johnson and his wife, and Sam Milligan and myself. And what we did, we were just kind of interconnected as far as business and politics, you know, and kind of like the fathers. We really weren't the fathers of Greeneville, but kind of relied on to lead and to guide the people here. On October the 28th, 1830, I married my first wife, Elizabeth Britton. She was the daughter of James and Jane Britton, and we had 4 children together. And also during the 1830s, I traveled to different states as a brick mason. I went to North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia while my wife and 4 kids stayed here in Greeneville. From 1847 to 1848, I served in the Mexican War as a sergeant in the commissary department, and I also served under Major Sam Milligan. So Sam and I were close friends for many years. In 1847, I also contracted yellow fever and was confined to my room for 17 days. And during that time, because of the high price of boarding and then the high price of meals, I lost a total of 36 pounds during that time. On May the 22nd, 1848, my first wife Elizabeth died at age 37. And then on March the 23rd, 1854, I married her sister, Louisa Britton, and we had 1 son. His name was Joseph. He served as deputy registrar, deputy clerk and master, trustee, and county court clerk. He held all these offices at the same time. So he was a busy person. From 1864 to 1868, I spent a lot of time in Knoxville and wrote back to my wife and talked about the high price of boarding in the Civil War. Then in April the 8th, 1876, Louisa died at age 54. And then on July the 27th, 1888, I died at age 77. One other thing, I was very tight with my money. One other story, I wrote back to my wife when she lived here in Greeneville, and I was over in Asheville, North Carolina, and sent $5 and told her that should last her for 3 months, not to spend it on anything unnecessarily. And then while the Civil War was going, I wrote back to her, and I wrote back to Louisa, and I told her, I sent her some money and said for her to spend that on the garden, not to spend on anything for household goods. One thing, also Blackston, he also was a Mason, and he actually formed the first lodge here in Greeneville. And of course, Blackston's buried here, and Louisa's buried here, and it's kind of odd that Elizabeth, his first wife, is buried up here, and then we have a daughter here that's buried, and then a granddaughter buried here. But do you all have any questions?
Just a comment. When you said he sent his wife $5 to last 3 months, that governor had a lot of fair in Argentina. For one birthday present, he sent his wife a picture of a bicycle. She wanted a bike, and he sent her a picture of a bike.
So that could be worse.
That could be all kind among other things
Among
going
other
on.
things, yes. That should have been a tip-off right there.
Yeah, I mean, it amazes me. I haven't got to read all. I mean, it's fascinating to read the journals. I didn't get to read much. I just kind of got the basic facts down. But he has descendants still living here in for several generations, but here in Greeneville
the Britton house that was next to the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, or was that a different one?
Well, I don't know. See, this church, this cemetery was actually a split part of that church, I believe. I may be misspeaking on that. I don't know. Could very well be, because Britton was
called it the Britton house. I don't know.
Yeah, because back many years ago, I mean, the Brittons was a common name, and I'm sure they all were related, especially if they were from Greeneville.
I'm glad you made the point about the name change from McDaniel to McDaniel. I'll bet for a lot of people studying their genealogy,
that too.
That would make it difficult.
Well, it was a common practice. I had a great-great-grandfather. His last name was Snowden, and they spelled it S-N-O-D-E-N. And the only thing I can think is maybe they didn't pronounce it Snowden, and they started pronouncing it Snodden, I guess. And so they put a W in there to help with the pronunciation. So, but with McDaniel and McDonald, I don't really know. Maybe he just liked McDaniel better and changed it to that. But yeah, it is. I mean, I haven't found any reasoning because I kind of wanted to find out. Well, why did you change your name? But
did you do your own research?
Well, no. Sherry Britton, I did a little bit on mine. Sherry Britton handed us kind of the basics, and I kind of went out. And I actually got to talk to one of his relatives here, and so I got a little bit more information. So that was kind of neat.
Are there any McDonald's left?
No. Not that most of the descendants are through the Brittons. I don't know about his descendants because see, he was from Knoxville, so I'm sure there was some, down that way, probably his descendants.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
My journey begins with my mother. In 1838, my mother was born Sylvia Manuel to the parents of Jesse and Bertie Manuel. October 26, 1841, I was born Mary Cadanza. My mother married John Harris in 1844, and I took his name. In 1855, I was considered a free girl of color at the age of 16, but was attained to James Britton until the age of 21. In the year of 1859, I married Isaiah Seville. He was attained to the state of Valentine Seville. In the year 1862, our precious son Charlie was born. In 1863, Isaiah obtained 1.5 acres of land in Greeneville from the James Britton estate. This was during the Civil War. In 1874, Charlie died at the age of 12. In June 6, 1880, I died, and I was buried next to my son. My husband Isaiah remarried, and his second wife is buried in the Wesley Heights Cemetery. If you would like to receive more information about us, you can go to the Genealogy Center in Greeneville, Tennessee. And the rest of my journey comes from Asheville and Weaverville. This is my family. Thank you.
I was Captain John McCoy. I was born in 1842 on the Water Fork prong of Camp Creek, just south of the Chuckey River here. My pa was Squire Billy McCoy. My ma was Annabelle Monsher. My pa was a millwright by trade, and in his line of work he became acquainted with a man named David Fry, who ran a mill out by Conley's Bridge after he came home from the Mexican War. He and my pa became very good friends. David Fry later became very influential in my life. In the summer of 1861, after the war started, David Fry traveled around Greene County recruiting a company of men to take north to Kentucky to join the Union Army. I was 19 years old when I signed on with him. We headed north to Kentucky. We traveled at night and slept in the daytime. We got across Hawkins and Hancock County without any problem. But once we got to Lee County, Virginia, it was a different world up there. The Confederate sympathies were very strong in Lee County. Confederate patrols and home guards were on all the roads and mountain passes all over the place. Every family in Lee County had 5 or 6 dogs that slept all day and stayed up all night looking for Tennessee boys trying to get to Kentucky to join the Union Army. But we finally made it to Camp Dick Robinson in Girard County, Kentucky. There, David Fry was made captain of the group he had recruited, Company F of the 2nd Tennessee Volunteer Infantry. Maybe because of our family friendship, or maybe because he thought I had the ability, but he made me first sergeant of the company, a 19-year-old first sergeant. None of us had any military experience. We were all in the same boat. He tried his best to make me a good soldier, and I tried my best to be one. David Fry wasn't with us very long until he was called in by General Thomas to accept a secret mission back here to Greene County to burn a railroad bridge over Lick Creek. He successfully carried the mission out, but 5 local men lost their lives. They were arrested by the Confederates and executed. They were hanged. David Fry made his way into the mountains of North Carolina and spent the winter there, the winter of 1861. He recruited another company of men to take back north in the spring. In the spring of 1862, when they started to Kentucky, they weren't so fortunate this time. In Lee County, Virginia, they were surrounded by Confederate patrol. David Fry was shot and badly wounded, and several of his men, they were captured, were put in jail in Jonesville, Virginia, the Lee County jail. He was treated by a Confederate doctor there until he was able to travel, and then he was transferred to Knoxville, to the Confederate jail in Knoxville. Later in the year, he and several other Union prisoners were transferred to the Confederate prison in Atlanta. It was actually the Fulton County jail being used as a Confederate prison. They were under death sentence. In October of that year, the night before he was to be executed, they broke out of the Fulton County jail. Part of them managed to escape, part of them were recaptured. But David Fry made it back, and he came into the mountains of North Georgia and then back up into the mountains of North Carolina. He spent the winter there. In the spring of 1863, he made his way back to his command at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. We were all overjoyed to see him. None of us knew if he were dead or alive. Because of our family friendship, we had our picture made together in Murfreesboro. This was in the fall of 1863. David Fry was given another assignment, a secret mission. He was a member of the Union Secret Service. I was discharged as Company First Sergeant of Company F of the 2nd Tennessee Volunteer Infantry to accept a commission in Company K of the 8th Tennessee Cavalry. That's the reason in this picture I'm wearing the hat of an enlisted man here, a Confederate or a Union enlisted man, and here I'm wearing a cavalry hat. I served in the cavalry till 1865, till the war was over. I came back home here to Greeneville and married Ella Dobson, a local girl. The fall of 1865, the next year in 1866, we had a little daughter, little Minnie. She's buried right here. She lived less than a year. She died in 1867. We were heartbroken. I was still in the Army, and I accepted an assignment to go to Lebanon, Kentucky to build a military cemetery there. I took a group of over 100 soldiers. Ella went with me. We stayed there for 3 years. We went to country churchyards, family cemeteries, hospital cemeteries, battlefields, removing the bodies of Union soldiers. We recovered the bodies of 865 men, which were reinterred at Lebanon National Cemetery, which you can still see there today. We finished the job in 1870, and we came back home here to Greeneville. I was given a job as town constable of Greeneville, the first law enforcement officer that the town of Greeneville had ever had. Served in the job for a few years, and I was also a member of the Andrew Johnson Guards. It was a patriotic organization organized in honor of our president. When he died in 1875, our group was second in the funeral procession. We followed the Masonic procession. In 1877, in my job as a town constable, it became my duty to serve a warrant on a man from western Greene County named John Davis. It was a rather trivial matter, in my opinion, but he took it apparently seriously. Less than a year later, we came upon each other in the office rooms of the John Mason Hotel over at the corner of Depot Street. A few words were exchanged. John Davis took out a pistol and shot me in the left breast. I managed to walk a short distance up the street to Galbraith's drugstore, where I died. It's not known if Ella ever remarried. She's found in the census in Texas several years later, and there's a story that she's buried in Asheville, North Carolina, but historians have never really been able to track her life successfully after the death of John McCoy in 1878. Some folks have wondered about the cemetery fence here, why it's so large and only contains the bodies of 2 people. I think the answer to that is that when little Minnie died in 1867, John McCoy had this fence built to be a family plot, not knowing how things were going to turn out later.
Is that really an 1867 fence?
Pardon?
Is that really an 1867
No,
fence?
I think the fence was built maybe, shortly after, sometime between 1867 and when he was killed in 1878.
Holy mackerel.
So he's there, and the baby, and nobody else?
Just the 2 of them.
Oh my goodness.
Anyone have any other questions? I think it's about time for the gong. It's about time for the temperature.
I died of cholera on June 30th, 1873, when the cholera epidemic was raging through our community. It's a terrible disease. Cholera starts out with a simple diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, quickly accelerates into a watery diarrhea. If the patient survives for 24 hours, it's possible to lose 2 to 3 gallons of fluids. That drains your body of salts. You're extremely dehydrated. The skin becomes cold and shrunken into your cheeks. Your pulse slows down. Your breathing slows down. You go into a coma and actually die in shock. It's very fast. Some people came down with cholera and died on the same day. Without a doubt, young Dr. Maloney brought the disease into Greeneville. He was one of the 2 physicians locally. He had been in Nashville, where cholera was prevalent, and returned to Greeneville on May the 23rd, 1873. Went to the Maloney house. Soon thereafter, he became quite ill, and Dr. Smith, Dr. E.B. Smith, the other physician in town, was called to see what was the problem and how he could treat it. After examining Dr. Maloney, Dr. Smith said he had never seen nor had he ever treated it, but he was certain that it was Asiatic cholera, and it was. Dr. Maloney survived, but he was ill for quite a while, quite a long time, leaving Dr. Smith as the only physician to tend to the many, many patients who were coming down with cholera in town. On the 10th of June, the first local person to come down with cholera was Mr. Piper, who lived down the hill from Dr. Maloney. On the 10th of June, he came down with cholera and he died that same day. The community was very uneasy, anxious, and Mr. Piper's body was taken 10 miles out of town and buried in the Baytown Cemetery in an effort to prevent the spread of the disease, if possible, within the community. It did not work. On the 14th of June, an entire family was wiped out. The Bible family, Mr. and Mrs. Bible and their child. There was no one else left in that family. On the 19th of June, Sarah Bryson and her child died. On the 25th of June, Callie Reeves, who was the daughter of Major James Reeves, died. After her death, sometime after her death, some years after her death, her father built this home over here. Callie never lived there, but that's where her family was living. No one knows exactly how many people died in the cholera epidemic. Dr. Smith kept a record of as many as he could that he was treating, but he quit with that record. It must have been too hard to keep up with. Remember, he was exhausted. Anyone who could sent their family out of town. Dr. Smith sent his family to the Stover home on the Newport Road. It was very scary. Imagine having the disease that I described to you. Imagine Sarah Bryson having that disease and knowing full well what was happening to her, having to watch her child with the same disease dying at the same time. There's nothing you could do. People would go to someone's funeral, and 2 or 3 days later, their funeral would be being held. It was that fast. At this time, there were about 1,000 people in town, somewhere around 1,039 people. It's not known exactly how many people died, whether it was 100, 150, some people have said 200. If it was 150, that was more than a tenth of the population of this town. That would have been horrible, it would have been frightening, it would have been scary. A local citizen, a Mr. Ingersoll, telegraphed the mayor of Knoxville. Dr. Smith was worn out. Mr. Ingersoll told the mayor of Knoxville, Mayor Rule, in the telegram, "One of our physicians is ill and the other is exhausted. Send 2. That afternoon, Mayor Rule contacted Dr. Tadlock, and Dr. Tadlock agreed to come to Greeneville on very short notice. The next train was leaving in less than an hour. Dr. Tadlock, on arrival in Greeneville around 4 o'clock that afternoon, went straight to Dr. Smith, and he and Dr. Smith went to visit a family that Dr. Smith had been treating just out of town, a Mitchell family. The family had 4 children. Before they got there that morning, one of the children had died of cholera. That afternoon, shortly before their arrival, a second child died of cholera. When they arrived at the house, little Ruth was critically ill, on a pallet on the floor. She lived 48 hours. Their 4th child got cholera but was able to survive. You can see how it totally destroyed whole families in no time. It must have been extremely frightening and a very scary time to live. Dr. Tadlock, of course, was treating many of the cholera patients. Some he was successful with, as was Dr. Smith, and many he was not. Andrew Johnson had cholera, came down with cholera. Whether Dr. Tadlock treated him or not, I don't know. But Dr. Tadlock was told by Andrew Johnson that he was certain that when the citizens returned to Greeneville, they would reward him amply. But Dr. Tadlock ended up having to sue for his pay, which may have tempered his attitude about Greeneville. He felt that the reason the disease was so prevalent and spreading so fast was that Greeneville was a highly unsanitary town. He said that many people who had privies would be uphill from the cisterns, so that whatever was in the privy would be draining into the cistern. Many people, according to Dr. Tadlock, did not have cisterns. They had their chamber pots, and they would take whatever was in the chamber pot out and just spread it out on the ground. The topography of Greeneville, there are two hillsides, and Greeneville is in the middle. Whatever was on the ground would sink down into the big spring, the major source of water for most of the citizens of Greeneville. The big spring, of course, runs into and becomes a Richland Creek. So anything that was in a privy or poured out on the ground uphill from the big spring was getting to the big spring. And that is how Dr. Tadlock credited with the speed of this disease. People downstream from the town of Greeneville were coming down with cholera too. If they washed their fruits and vegetables in there, they were eating that water. If they washed their children, that's what was happening. People outside of the area, outside of where the creek goes, were also coming down with it. Perhaps they would come into Greeneville, drink water, eat the food, or come into Greeneville, or someone from Greeneville would come to them and share whatever vegetables they had. This was used repeatedly. I'll talk really fast. This coffin was used repeatedly. It was large enough to put a large body in or a small body. The body was put in, the coffin was brought. This is a mass grave where you're standing. A fourth of the cemetery was a mass grave for cholera victims. The coffin was brought to the mass grave, a simple service was performed, and the coffin was tipped up, the trap door was in and open, and the body would slide off into the mass grave. The coffin would be taken back and another body put in, and the process repeated.
Recycling.
It was not covered over every day, but lime was spread on the bodies. It was being used so often. You have to, it's hard to put your mind in a mindset to understand what was going through the people here. I don't know how they stood it. The ones who stayed in town or the ones who were able to leave.